podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. Every once in a while, as an editor, an article comes across your desk and you think, wow, why has nobody done this before? In this case, we recently published in Volume 4, Issue 2, an article called From Citizen Soldier to Secular Saint that looks at the implications of military exceptionalism. The authors, Dr. Heidi Urban, Dr. Sue Bryant, and Mr. Brett Swaney, went through and took a look through survey data at the perception of the military of themselves. It's widely publicized that the military is one of the most trusted institutions in American society with the highest degree of confidence. But the question of how the military views themselves is a bit different than that, and one that has significant implications. So we're fortunate today to be joined by the authors of that article, Dr. Sue Bryant, Dr. Heidi Urban, and Mr. Brett Swaney, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves now.
I'm Sue Bryant. I'm a retired Army colonel. I served 28 years in the United States Army. I'm currently an adjunct associate professor at Georgetown University, and I'm also a visiting fellow at National Defense University. It's great to be here today.
Thanks, Doyle, and thanks for having us. This is Heidi Urban. I'm also a retired Army colonel and adjunct associate professor in Georgetown University's Security Studies program. I'm also an adjunct scholar at West Point's Modern War Institute and a non-resident senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And we appreciate our opportunity to chat with you here today, and also thank the National Defense University, for which Sue and Brett and I are affiliated with, for sponsoring this research.
Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity. Brett Swaney, I'm a assistant research fellow at the National Defense University.
And I would just emphasize that while the authors do have an affiliation with these institutions, that the views that they're going to be expressing are their own and shouldn't be taken as views of the government or any government organization with which they're currently affiliated or have been previously. So it's just a delight to have you guys with us today. Probably the best question to begin with is, why does this question matter, how the military views itself?
Yeah, I think the question is a really, really important one, simply because the military, as Samuel Huntington says, has control of the organized use of violence in the United States or, around the world. And as a result of that, understanding how the military sees itself is vital to understanding the overall health of the United States of America, and it's critical to our government. One of the things that I was so interested in was the fact that there has been so little scholarship that has been written with regard to this, and we've been nearly 20 years at war. So I've had a wonderful time, working with Heidi and Brett, whom I'll pass this over, talk a little bit more about it.
Sue's right. It's hard to get real insights into attitudes of members of the military. It's even harder to get insights into how members of the military think society views them. And we thought there was this just important time to think about this right now. The connection between society and its military is worth examining. Nearly 20 years after 9/11, we're closing in on the 50-year anniversary of the all-volunteer force. And we have this unique moment in American history where the public views its military with equal parts ignorance and reverence. And as you said, Doyle, has this extraordinary trust and confidence in the military compared to declining levels of confidence in civilian institutions. And so for all of these reasons, we really wanted to probe the attitudes of military elites, especially. What do they think about all of this?
Yeah, and one of the things that you allude to briefly in the article is that confidence from the American public has been robust even during periods when the objective achievement of military goals by military forces over 2 decades of conflict has been contested at best and probably could be characterized in some instances as a loss. And so it's a fascinating phenomenon because, in many ways, if you go back to the great line from Patton that America loves a winner and will not abide a loser, the argument might be that the military should be in a position not unlike where it was at the end of the Vietnam War right now.
I think that's a great observation. And I think it also shows we don't know what goes into the trust and confidence levels that the public looks at the military with. So there's a lot still, we shed a little bit of light, at least how the military thinks about these issues. but we still don't have great insights into how the public views its military and what's the source of that trust and confidence.
So, one thing that struck me as I looked, the questions from the survey that was administered are reproduced in Appendix A to the article, which is available online and can be seen there. It strikes me that the survey looks at much more than just the really interesting questions that you go into in the article. So, I'm wondering if you talk a little bit about the larger project that you're clearly embarked on.
We began looking at the dearth of survey data associated with this, and the fact that there has been very little longitudinal study that's been done. As we were speaking earlier, one of the reasons that that longitudinal study has been hard to get at is because it's so hard to actually get the data. So when constructing this survey, Brett and Heidi and I really wanted to work using a lot of the data that had already been gathered from the Triangle Institute study between Fever and Cone about 20 years ago. So we took the survey that they used and then added to it some more data that was probably more relevant to the recent wars. And our hope is to do two things. One is to be able to create a database that is resident at National Defense University inside INSS to allow other scholars access to the data and to allow them to do some ongoing research. And then second, in order to be able to produce what the 20 years of war has actually done in terms of our civil military relations.
Yeah, no, I would just maybe add here too, this is an ongoing study. So we, sort of kicked it off in the 2016, 2017 timeframe. And we've surveyed every year, and we've continued to survey every year at National Defense University. And then, of course, at some of our partner institutions, West Point and the U.S. Military College of Carlisle, have been super helpful in this endeavor and kind of helping break through some of the traditional DoD resistance to looking at these kinds of issues.
I'll ask you then, based on this overall survey, what were the major findings that you chose to explore in this article? Could you just summarize them briefly for our listeners?
Sure. The specific themes we wanted to address in this article were those relating to the isolation, unequal burden sharing, and increasing sentiments of exceptionalism or superiority among military elites. And so these are some of the highlights from our survey research over the past few years. While a majority of respondents agreed that the American public is grateful for the sacrifices members of the military make, only 1/4 agreed that the public understands the sacrifices that members of the military make today. 1/5 of respondents, and again, we're talking what we call military elites, so more senior officers attending the War College, Senior Service College, and cadets at the U.S. Military Academy. And we kind of follow the same classification Peter Fever and Dick Cone did with their TIS study years ago, but up and comers in the military. We found that 1/5 of respondents agreed that people who haven't served in the military generally shouldn't question or criticize the military. We found that 1/4 of respondents agreed that military culture is generally superior to the rest of society. And only about 2/3 of respondents agreed with the idea that it's good for the military to reflect society. A third either disagreed or were neutral.
There were some definite surprises for me when I took a look at that. Some of it didn't surprise me. Some of it reflected things that I'd observed in my years in the Navy. And although we'll get into this later, I'm sure there are likely to be service differences to some degree. There's also a similarity in the overall demographic. There were a few things that surprised me, but I'm curious. First, were there any of the findings that surprised you? And I'd ask each of you to mention it in turn if there were, what they were and why they did or why they didn't.
I think for me, the most surprising finding was probably obvious if I were to step back and think about it. And that is the fact that the first year that we ran the survey, we did not have a statistically significant number of women respond in order to even actually, make any decisions with regard to what they thought. It was just barely over the statistically significant line on minorities. And the first year was different in that we had only looked at people who were in class at National Defense University. So when you take this and you look at it and you extrapolate it, you say to yourself, well, all right, these are the people who are going to lead the United States military in the next 10 to 20 years. And oh, by the way, about 92% of them are white male. And that really hit me in the face hard.
That is a profound finding. It really is. Heidi, I'm curious for you.
You're right, Doyle. There were some of our findings we weren't that surprised about, frankly. We expected to see this, for lack of a better term, a little bit of a chip on the shoulder of some serving. This idea of, yep, I recognize that the public trusts us and is grateful for what we've done, but they also don't understand what we do. And frankly, we think we're a little bit better than the rest of society. I expected to find that in some degree, and we did. What I was surprised by were some of the cleavages within the officer corps and how attitudes diverge based on race, on gender at times, and on ideology and party identification as well. So we're used to this concept of a civil military gap, but we may have some evidence of some gaps within the officer corps and among military elites themselves.
Yeah, that is fascinating. It actually tracks with some of Jim Golby's work, suggesting that these views that are often attributed monolithically to the military may more correctly reflect the views of the demographics from which the military draws most significantly. But not a lot of attention has been paid to what the effects are then within the military when those groups, as you mentioned, Sue, move into positions where there are the presumptive next generation of leadership carrying with them the views that come perhaps from their societal influences. Brett, how about yourself?
Yeah, I think the one of the surprising bits for me was, questioning the extent to which I think, these military elites sort of believe their own precedent and think they may be superior to society. The society they've sort of pledged to defend here. So I think we probed that by asking, if they agreed with the idea that, those who have not served in the military generally should not question or criticize the military. And if I recall, I think that was prompted, sort of at the time, I think it was, White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders had sort of said, it would be highly inappropriate to question General Kelly, who was serving as the White House Chief of Staff at the time. Which I think at least struck me as somewhat odd. And, in our survey, fewer than, I think it was about a quarter agreed, but I'll defer to Heidi on the actual statistic there, but it wasn't a large number. But what was interesting about it to me was that the West Point cadets, the younger generation, I think, agreed to a higher degree than their more senior counterparts. So in a way, those with the least amount of time and experience sort of in the profession, they were actually more likely to think that those, serving should be kind of immune from this level of questioning or criticism from outsiders, perhaps. It was interesting to me to think that, over the duration of their career, as they're kind of exposed to the profession of arms, I guess the more likely they are to support oversight or criticism of the institution kind of as they rise through the ranks. But that younger generation's perspective, I think, kind of caught me off guard a little bit.
Yeah, and one of the things that struck me about that, and we'll get to a little bit later some of the challenges of doing extensive survey work with DoD personnel, but one of the things that struck me, sometimes you read a survey and you think, wow, I wish we had the opportunity to ask a different group about it. And I would love to see comparative data, both among ROTC cadets, who may be in a less insular environment than a service academy, as well as between and among the service academies, simply because there are slightly different cultures that have grown up at those places, in part due to history, in part due to geography, and in part due to service culture. And it would be really interesting to see to what extent you see those same trends mirrored. It really is interesting, though. It was striking the amount of difference between the junior folks and the senior folks as you went forward there.
And I don't think, I think there's an encouraging way, there's a way to interpret that in an encouraging light, right? That the longer folks stay in, the more you become socialized to norms of the profession. And when a 18-year-old kid shows up at a service academy or an ROTC department, they're a product of all sorts of socialization effects of where they're from and their parental influences and all of that. And I think it reinforces the broader acknowledgement that, wow, socialization takes a good while. We have this idea that, oh, you come out of basic training and you are a soldier, and you come out of West Point and you are an officer. But it really, I think, it it gives us the reminder that the professionalization aspect and the socialization to these key professional norms happens over a career.
No, I think that's a great point that it may not be all that noteworthy that a high achieving high school student who has been told that they're a high achieving high school student achieving exceptional things thinks that they're exceptional. And the noteworthy thing may be the degree to which they are socialized to the idea that they are in a position of servant leadership. That's so yeah, that is definitely a more positive interpretation.
I was just going to say, I was going to add on. I think all the services actually do a really good job of, inculcating this idea of servant leadership, but I think it's maybe a little bit more geared towards, subordinates, sort of within the team. And so maybe that's an area that, DoD needs to think about tweaking a little bit, that it may be gearing, the servant leadership idea a little bit more towards, the citizenry at a younger level.
One of the things that you explore, as you mentioned, is this sense of exceptionalism and isolation. And the phrase that you used, I think, is perhaps a bit intentionally slightly provocative, which is the development of a warrior caste. And one of the critiques I've heard of this concept is that it's perhaps not unusual within professions for there to be a generational effect, that the kids of lawyers are more likely to go into law, the kids of doctors more likely to go into medicine. You probably can make an exception for structural reasons for Catholic clergy, but this is something that we tend to see in professions. So how is this different in the military and what effect does it have?
Interestingly, just to begin this, Heidi and I are both members of the warrior caste. So not only are we retired military, we're also card carrying members of the warrior caste. Heard a lot about the idea that, doctors, children become doctors or medical professionals. But I think that qualitatively it's different when you're talking about the United States military or any military. The reason that it is different is because you are talking yet again about the control over the use and the management of force and violence. And so when you have control over the use and the management of force and violence that has accrued to a generational lineage, which coupled with the isolation that we're also seeing, and then couple that again with increasing partisanship, I think, in fact, there is room for some serious concern.
Heidi, Brett, any thoughts to add there?
I think it also raises the question of, do we as a society want our military to reflect us and represent us and look like us? And there's a lot to be proud about family service in the military. As Sue said, yep, my dad served a full career in the Army. I think of the visual imagery of when General McConville, our current Army Chief of Staff, was at his confirmation hearing, and his children sat behind him, all clad in their Army service uniform. And of course, every member of Congress commented on that. And it's universally praised today. So I'm not here to denigrate the idea of family service, but it comes with implications, right? It comes with second and third order effects of perhaps a small segment already has now become even more narrow and more isolated from broader society. So I think these are just things we want to grapple with. It's not to dissuade generations from serving, but how do we balance this and keep that connection between the military and broader society?
And one of the questions about that has a lot to do with recruiting. And you guys mentioned briefly about the fact that recruitment into the military is geographically and socioeconomically concentrated. And I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about whether or how that contributes to the warrior caste phenomenon as well.
I think one of the things that I'm always surprised by is it doesn't just have, I think you'll often hear the South disproportionately provides a large chunk of recruits today. And that's true. But what's also true is that the areas immediately surrounding military bases provide a disproportionate number of recruits. And so, again, I think it was 2005, the last time we had a base realignment and closure. And so, as we consolidate our bases and we kind of cloister on these big, gigantic mega bases, at least in the Army, I think of Fort Bragg and Fort Hood and Joint Base Lewis McChord is probably comprising a large chunk of the U.S. Army. Geographically, we become a little bit more restricted and remote. And the other thing I'll offer here is, as we were thinking through recommendations, well, what do you do with these findings that we uncovered? I almost hesitate anytime we offer a recommendation on, well, we got to recruit in more diverse areas, and we can't just continue to fish where the fish are, and that's what we do. Because I recognize recruiting is really, really tough business. It is a thankless job, first of all, and it's really, really hard. And I know every service will have a presentation at the ready to tell you just how hard it is to recruit today, and kind of whittle down the eligible population that really can serve at any given time, and who they're in competition with for those young people. So I do think we constantly have to care about it. We need to give good thought about how and where and who we recruit. But we also need to pay a whole lot of attention to who leaves once we have recruited them. Who are we retaining and who are we not retaining, and why? And we get so focused at the aggregate level of maintaining, our current force structure and balance. It's hard to measure that loss, and the loss perhaps in diversity, and why people choose to get out. So as much as I do care about recruitment, I also care about retention.
No, I think that's a great point. I had to smile when you commented about recruiting being a thankless task, because it struck me that I've been guilty myself of sailors who I blame a recruiter for, but somehow the ones who were exceptional were always exceptional because of my leadership. So it's an easy trap to fall into. But Heidi, I want to pick up the thread that you started to pull here about the effects of retention and diversity. And one of the most striking statistics for me, and most disturbing, was the disparity between minority respondents and white respondents as to whether they would advise a loved one to enter the military, and their pride in their military service. And I'm curious if I can get you guys to talk more about the implications of that, why you think that is, and what it is we might do about it.
So I'll just offer a couple of the wave top findings, and we'll all chime in here. Yes, it hands down was kind of the moment where I ran the data multiple times to make sure I was reading it correctly and I wasn't missing something. But what we found were whites were twice as likely as African Americans to agree that military culture is superior to civilian society. We found that whites were also more likely to express pride in service and more likely to encourage a young person close to them to join the military than African Americans. And I think as we conclude, what does this mean? It kind of causes me to do a whole host of introspection on my own career in the Army, and what have I missed and what have I failed to interpret. But it requires much more introspection than from what we can gain from this survey, right? I can come with all sorts of conclusions on why this might be the case, but I think it goes back to why we have to ask deeper questions of those who serve on why they serve and how they feel about their service. And when they leave, why are they leaving? Because absent that, we have some concerning findings, but all sorts of ways of interpreting it.
Yeah, I would only add on to this that the survey data and the number is so limited, and the finding was so concentrated to disproportionately a pool of cadets at the United States Military Academy, that although it was very significant, and although it was a shocking finding that we had not started out to look for, I feel that there needs to be a very large caveat put aside of it, and we need to say, look, this bears further investigation. But it absolutely is an important topic, and it must be investigated.
Yeah, I'll just glom onto that and triple tap it, that it's clearly there are communities that are experiencing their military service very differently than, sort of the majority community. And yeah, our sample's really Army heavy. I know the Air Force, I think, has been sort of, tentatively poking at some of these issues, but there needs to be a broader and much deeper look at it.
Yeah, I was in a discussion with couple of serving and couple of retired naval officers recently, and the chief of naval operations had recently put out the Navy's reading list, and it included for the first time readings on race relations, things like that. And some of the officers were expressing their skepticism that this was an appropriate topic to be included in a professional reading list. And I think if nothing else, the findings in this suggest that this is an integral part of a force that is cohesive and able to perform up to its maximum potential. Whatever you feel about the social justice of it, if for no other reason than efficacy, leaving aside the oath that we've taken, if for no other reason than efficacy, it is a critical part of making the military into the effective force it needs to be.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things is the statistics regarding African Americans was the most stark, but that was not the only minority group that was showing slightly different views with regard to pride and service. If you were to take this down and you were to look at people who self-identified as conservative versus people who self-identified as liberal, you would also see a difference. If you were to take men and women and put those side by side, you would also see a difference as well. The point that I would like to make is that although the findings with regard to African American pride and service were the most stark, they were not the only differentiations that are worth mentioning. There's also differentiations between service members who considered themselves to be conservative versus service members who considered themselves to be liberal, as well as differences in pride of service between men and women. And the larger point that I think we try to emphasize is that there's probably a difference in the way that service is conceptualized between those who represent the majority of serving versus those who come into a minority status for one reason or another. And I think that all of that bears some really significant investigation.
Yeah, and it feeds back again. You mentioned that your survey is neither random nor representative, but by choosing up and comers, if the up and comers are disproportionately part of one demographic, it may not be surprising that those who aren't part of that demographic feel less comfortable and less sense of belonging in that group, if that's the signal that these are the folks who are going to be leadership of the next generation. But your point about differences by partisanship and ideological disposition is an interesting one. There's been some really interesting work done over the last couple of years trying to unpack this question about confidence in the military along partisan dimensions. And David Burbach at the Naval War College has a terrific paper in Armed Forces and Society. Michael Robinson at West Point has done some great work on this. Heidi, I know that you're working on a book on exactly this topic at the same time. I'm curious, first, let's talk a little bit about what your findings were there, and then what you think the implications of that may be for civil military relations going forward.
Yeah, so this has formed, I think, a major focus of research within civil military relations for 30 years now. And it may have started with Tom Ricks's book, Making the Corps, and his first article that appeared on that suggested the officer corps, especially, was conservative and Republican far more so than their peers in the broader public. And while that's not the major focus of this article, we did find in our research that the officer corps, especially in its senior ranks, are consistently conservative and reliably Republican. Now, and as many scholars before us have noted, there's nothing normatively wrong with officers affiliating with one party over the other. We'd note that it hasn't always been that way. Like in the 1970s, the majority of the officer corps would self-identify as independents. But where I think there's interest in probing that further beyond just the how do you how do you affiliate and self-identify is, are there noticeable and notable differences in how officers act and behave based off of their ideology and partisan affiliation? And tying that back to what you said, Doyle, about how does this impact the broader tide of the American public and the trust and confidence that they have in the military writ large. So a couple of the things that Sue alludes to, we found attitudes did vary based off of ideology and party. We found that conservatives and Republicans were more likely to say military culture is superior to the rest of society. They're less likely to say that it's good for the military to look like and reflect society and so forth. There's consistent findings throughout other survey research that points at conservatives and Republicans and liberals and Democrats think differently within the military and the officer corps, and that's probably not surprising. But how does this then turn and impact how the public views the military? And that's the big question, right? Do they increasingly look at the institution as a partisan actor? Certainly, our survey data can't hit at that yet, but in this time of intense polarization, I think it's a reminder that it's very easy for another institution, even the U.S. military, to quickly have a partisan light be shown on it. And if that's a function of how those in the military behave, that should concern senior leaders as well.
Yeah, I guess I'll step out here and just say, over the last 4 years, I think we've seen a veritable sort of Civ-Mil minefield kind of played out. And the idea that the military would be construed within the public mind as becoming partisan. I think senior military are very keenly aware of the danger there, and certainly our survey data kind of backs that up.
And I think there's also a risk that is sometimes not articulated, that once they're sensitized to that concern, in an effort to avoid the appearance of anything that is partisan, the answer may be to, in fact, avoid engagement with questions which are not themselves inherently partisan, but which may have become the subject of partisan dispute societally. And that doesn't do much of a service either, because it gives the impression that somehow topics that are perhaps relatively clear within the context of the military oath and service are taboo for discussion, or otherwise somehow too controversial to be brought up in that setting. That's a real challenge as well. I noted that with the more senior respondents, you had some diversity by service. And I realized that it's difficult to be able to get really strong, significant conclusions based on the relatively small sample size from each service. And I'm also curious because with the question about whether or not they had seen combat experience, you start to get a little bit towards branches, although the nature of combat over the last several years has maybe blurred that distinction. I'm just curious, both based on your data and anecdotally, based on your experience, whether you think that these phenomenon that you've measured in this survey do vary by service, and perhaps within service, whether they vary by branch or specialization.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it, Doyle. I have always looked for a service effect. As I've done surveys in the past within the Army, I've always tried to see, might we find an effect between what we used to describe as combat arms, combat support, combat service support. And I've rarely found distinctions, especially when it comes to matters of politics and partisanship. Now, I'll back out for a second and say this also shows how hard it is to do multi-component surveys in DoD today. It has become really, really hard. And it just makes us especially grateful that NDU sponsors survey research like this, which is where we can get sometimes a joint sample. It just tends to be a much smaller joint sample. And as you said, it's very skewed. We're talking senior officers. So we really want to hesitate when we draw big, broad conclusions, because number one, we're talking just the officer corps typically. And then within that, a really small portion. But what I can say is that anytime I've had the opportunity to survey respondents from all of the services, I've rarely found notable distinctions based off something, relating to service. The only real service related variable I've ever found to be significant is rank. Like how, and I think that can be sometimes interpreted just as longevity in service, not just race or age. And we control for all of those things, but typically rank tends to matter, but inter-service and intra-service variables less so.
I think there's another interesting point here to add on to what Heidi was saying, and that was just the difficulty of constructing the questions in a way that would be understood and defined by members of different services in the same way. Have you served a tour in combat? Well, okay, that may mean something to one service differently than it means, how many tours have you served? Well, if you're coming out of SOCOM, a tour can be 30 days, whereas if you're coming out of the air, and so just trying to get an even playing field on what is going through people's minds as they're answering these questions became very difficult as we were trying to construct these in a very neutral manner that would be understood by everyone.
No, just to, anecdotally, probably not quite as much as Sue or Heidi, but yeah, I think National Defense University is just a really interesting sample for us to utilize here, because you do get those folks from all the different branches there. So it's a unique opportunity in that sense, and very grateful that they've been super supportive of the research. And I think hopeful as well that more partner institutions will gravitate towards this kind of study as well, so that we can kind of branch out beyond our heavy Army samples.
That's actually a great segue to the next thing that I wanted to bring up. And Sue and I were discussing this a bit before we started to record. But I think one of the reasons why you guys' article is so pathbreaking and so unique is that there are some significant obstacles to doing survey research with Department of Defense personnel. And I'm curious if you guys could discuss how your research was supported were challenged by the DoD structure, and if you had a clean slate wish list, what you would do given these opportunities?
Heidi, why don't I start with the challenges and then you can do the clean slate wish list? How's that? Um, I began this project in 2016, and I have to say that I got tremendous help from the people at INSS at NDU to work with this. And I'd originally reached out to DoD and went to the Office of Secretary of Defense, and I was told that there was just no way that the Office of Secretary of Defense was interested in approving any research because it was an election year. And so I looked back and I went, okay. So I went back and I started looking at all of the previous survey that had been done. And the conclusion that I came to is there's no such thing as a good time to do these surveys. There's always something going on. The second difficulty that you have is it's real. The amount of surveys that military personnel have to take on everything is just unbelievable. And so the survey fatigue is extraordinarily real. And the desire to protect the people from, or to protect the service members from all of us, marauding academics who are interested in getting into their heads, is, I think, actually, founded. But that said, there has to be a balance here that allows that to happen. And it's becoming more and more difficult to actually get partner institutions, particularly, I think, in this era of hyperpartisanship. There is a fear out there. And again, nobody wants to put the spotlight on themselves for fear of what they might find. With that, Heidi, I'll toss it over to you for the wish list.
Yeah, well, I think Sue described it very well, this survey fatigue that has only increased as we've been able to do online surveys, right? There were probably not as much survey fatigue when they were all mail-based surveys and there was a barrier to doing these in the first place. But since we've been able to execute so many online, people get inundated. But the Department of Defense has done a really good job of countering that, and it's by making it really hard to do online surveys. And so it's getting multiple layers of approval. If you want to survey more than one component, as you were talking about, Doyle, that requires even more levels of approval to go through. And what that does is it just has a barrier to good survey research. The other thing I would add is it encourages those who are within the institution, and frankly, all three of us have been within the institution, to do that survey research, and it makes it really hard for external folks to do that. And that strikes me as something really discouraging. So the wish list would be, let's make it a little bit easier and not require, I mean, all of these surveys with human subjects undergoes an IRB process. So I mean, it's not like these are all fast and loose, but these are pretty detailed IRB survey approvals. But above and beyond that, we might want to find a way to streamline it. And it goes back to Sue's broader point. We shouldn't be afraid of asking these questions. We should want to know the information to these questions. It provides policymakers all sorts of data to make informed decisions and target recruitment and retention off of. But we're not going to have that data if we don't ask those questions. And so reducing the barriers, especially to people outside DoD, to do these surveys, I think is a big first step.
For our listeners who may not be familiar, IRB is an institutional review board, which is a process to review any human subjects research in order to assure the protection of the human subjects. And for very good historical reasons, the Department of Defense, IRB, has a particular sensitivity to ensure that they are meeting a high standard in that, because the department has not always met that standard. I was also struck, Sue, by the irony of your comment about we can't do it during an election year. And I think that goes exactly to what we were just discussing, of this sort of sense that we must avoid anything that has anything at all to do with partisanship, when in fact it would seem odd that if you're truly nonpartisan, that somehow the presence or absence of an election year would have any impact on your ability to do the survey work. Brett, any thoughts on your wish list if you were to do that, or any of the challenges of doing the survey work here?
No, I think Heidi's got the wish list right on. I would just say for National Defense University is one component. They've been very supportive of the survey consistently over time. Advocating for or making the time and the space, because survey fatigue is definitely real, especially for the students at that level and in that location. So those are all very consistent, but National Defense University has been very supportive of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would just absolutely echo. I mean, what you've described has paralleled my own limited experience in trying to do it, as well as that of any scholar I've spoken with. And it's like asking a cartographer to make a map without being able to go to the place that they're making a map of. And you're going to have a really low fidelity representation of what it is you're seeking to know if you can't get access to the actual data to take a look at it. Given the challenges of doing this survey work, it's not surprising that your survey was broader than just what you addressed in the article. So I'm curious if briefly you could talk about any additional projects that are coming out of this larger project overall and any things we should be on the lookout for soon.
Yeah, as Sue said early on, we've tried to keep the battery of questions constant from year to year in order to establish the closest thing we can get to a longitudinal study. We were inspired by the Foreign Policy Leadership Project, that started in the 70s that Ole Holsti led for years. We certainly took inspiration from the TIS project, Peter Feaver and Dick Cohn's Triangle Institute for Security Studies project. And so you'll see the same battery over and over again. And that helps us draw some changes over time. Again, we might not be able to survey that same individual, but we can survey the same group of students from year to year. And so the first just big broad effort is to chart changes in attitudes and opinions and all of these things over time to see, does the makeup of a senior officer cohort in any given time vary from time to time? And there is a tremendous amount of data that is being generated from this. We picked a handful of questions to highlight in this particular article that really probed these ideas of isolation and unequal burden sharing and sentiments of exceptionalism. A lot of the data that I'm interested in and working on right now is on partisanship and ideology and the so what of partisanship within the officer corps. And so working on that in a book project as well. But we're happy to have, I think, this wealth of data to just continue to explore themes with each coming cohort through NDU.
I don't know that it's directly on point, but the other thing that I've been very interested in, and I'm going to try to figure out how to work this into another project, has been the issue of military education and the data that we have been getting from our students with regard to military education. I was surprised by the demographics coming out of NDU in terms of male, female, white, minority. I was also stunned by the demographics associated with the educational paths. And what struck me was two things. One was how unbelievably well educated the students at NDU are, and that I believe 90% of them have at least one master's degree and are probably working on their second, and more than 12 or 13% have terminal degrees of one kind or another. But when you root out the degrees which have been granted by PME institutions, all of a sudden you're down to 15 or 20% of the total degrees that have been conferred. And I think that there's a really interesting echo chamber in terms of military education that is starting to arise. And I would love to be able to figure out how to explore what the real effects of that are, not just for those serving in the military, but also for the people who are at, the schools that are producing our future policymakers. And the fact that they are not actually with serving military members in the numbers that they probably should be.
That's a terrific point. And, it strikes me as also something where you're going to encounter substantial service variance. I taught for a little while at the Naval War College, and one of the frustrations with the Navy's culture of higher education has been that for many years, and I think it's started to change over the last several, but that for many years, the Naval War College was a place where they sent officers who were not competitive for further promotion, advancement, and positions of command. And so if you took a look at that same data about degrees, you would find a high number of terminal degrees, many of which would be MDs, some of which would be dental degrees, veterinary degrees, law degrees, any staff corps officer, but not officers who were headed out to command units of the line because they were off commanding units of the line or doing other things the Navy valued more highly institutionally. So it's an interesting and challenging question. We're coming up on the end of our allotted time. So I'd just like to ask each of you in turn for any closing thoughts, but I'll mix it up and reverse the order. So Brett, we'll start with you. Any closing thoughts on the article or its implications?
It's an incredibly important area to continue to look at. And I think that's the bigger message here, is that we sort of, I think, cracked the lid open a little bit here. But for the Department of Defense overall, there clearly needs to be a much broader attack or probing of these issues. We've highlighted a number of them in the paper, but I certainly think that a concerted effort to look at a lot of this stuff is warranted and probably way past due, quite frankly.
Some of the findings we have walk a fine line, that it's great to have pride in service. We should celebrate that. We also shouldn't feel bad that the majority of Americans have trust and confidence in the military. It's when these views get distorted or taken to an extreme that I think should cause service members and senior leaders pause, where that sense of pride can get distorted to a sentiment of exceptionalism or superiority. And then how that might differ within subgroups within the uniformed military and the officer corps bears some further introspection. And I think the timing is important of where we are nearly 20 years after 9/11. And again, as we wrestle with this unusual concoction of ignorance and reverence that the public has towards its military, we should care about it for those who have a vested interest within the military and who write and think about it. But the broader American public cares as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. So it's been very interesting because every once in a while I put out a nerdy esoteric article that nobody reads. This one has been very different for my family. And as I said, I'm a member of the Warrior Cast, and all of a sudden I've got family members I haven't talked to in a while calling me up. And it's been very interesting because what I have been hearing from them was something I hadn't considered. What I've been hearing from them is they're like, well, look, in terms of January 6th, I think it's interesting if you were to figure out how to do this with retired and population, how to do this with people who've gotten out of the service, how to look at how these attitudes manifest over the longer term into broader society, and what the implications of that are for. It's not really something I had considered. It's not something I thought about. It's not something I know how to do. But it was very interesting that all of a sudden my phone starts ringing and people whom I don't believe have coordinated with one another are giving me the same message.
Yeah, that would be absolutely fascinating. It's something that has struck me as well, is that so much of the discussion about the involvement of security forces, whether military or police, in the events of January 6th, when you peel it back, has been someone who served a 2-year enlistment and left under other than honorable circumstances, or someone who served 14 years but left as an E4, or, a number of other sorts of things that are flags that indicate that this was not a military up-and-comer. This did not represent military elite, and yet their military service comprised an important part of their identity, including an important part of the motivation for behaviors that obviously are very problematic to the stability of our democracy. So that would be a fascinating thing to get at. And when you figure out how to get at it, please let me know, because I really want to read that article. So we have been chatting with the authors of From Citizen Soldier to Secular Saint, The Societal Implications of Military Exceptionalism. That's Dr. Sue Bryant, Dr. Heidi Urban, and Mr. Brett Sweeney. The article appears in Volume 4, Issue 2 of the Texas National Security Review, and it can be read online at tnsr.org. Sue, Heidi, Brett, thank you guys so much for joining us. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you so much, Doyle.
Thank you, Doyle.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.